The moment Vivek Ramaswamy interrupted Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with that smug smile, he had no idea he was about to face the most devastating intellectual takedown in recent political history. By the end, he'd be forced to publicly admit he was wrong. The energy in the Harvard Kennedy School auditorium crackled with anticipation as two of America's most eloquent political figures prepared for what would become one of the most explosive confrontations in contemporary political dialogue. Vivek Ramaswamy, the entrepreneur turned political analyst, sat smugly across from Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett at the Distinguished Future of American Democracy Symposium. Ramaswamy had forged his reputation by challenging mainstream political wisdom with razor-sharp rhetoric and contemptuous commentary toward established politicians. His arrogance was unmistakable as he reclined in his chair, clearly anticipating another chance to showcase his intellectual dominance over what he perceived as conventional political thought. When Crockett commenced her presentation analyzing voter suppression strategies in modern American elections, Ramaswamy cut her off with a dismissive gesture and a patronizing grin. Congresswoman, with all due respect, these assertions about voter suppression are worn-out Democratic talking points that disregard the fundamental reality of election integrity standards. The dismissal was swift and brutal, delivered with the kind of intellectual smugness that had become Ramaswamy's signature. The audience shifted uncomfortably as this violation of panel decorum created instant friction in the room. What unfolded next would transform this moment of casual arrogance into a crushing lesson about the perils of underestimating adversaries who have mastered their craft. Crockett's rebuttal would not merely counter Ramaswamy's challenge, but methodically obliterate his position with such accuracy and command that it would leave him scrambling to salvage his dignity. Before we witness this remarkable exchange, where preparation confronted hubris and intellectual substance challenged hollow dismissal, please subscribe to our channel and share your location in the comments so we can continue delivering these moments when genuine expertise exposes political theater. The foundation was laid for a clash that would illustrate the distinction between rehearsed sound bites and meaningful knowledge rooted in authentic experience and thorough investigation. The intellectual battle between Vivek Ramaswamy and Jasmine Crockett represented far more than a simple policy dispute. Their confrontation embodied core differences in approaches to political dialogue, policy examination, and the significance of lived experience in democratic debate. Vivek Ramaswamy had established himself as a formidable force in American political commentary through his background as a successful biotech entrepreneur and his rise as a provocative voice in conservative politics. At 38 years old, he had cultivated his reputation by challenging what he labeled as establishment orthodoxy across the political landscape. His method of political discourse emphasized theoretical constructs, philosophical arguments, and sweeping critiques of contemporary American institutions. Ramaswamy's intellectual approach was marked by confident declarations and broad generalizations about American political culture. He had gained prominence through his readiness to dismiss opposing perspectives with cutting rhetoric and his capacity to articulate conservative positions with academic polish. His appearances on political panels and television shows typically featured him adopting contrarian stances and challenging accepted wisdom with apparent intellectual command. His particular stance on voting rights matters reflected his broader philosophical framework. Ramaswamy consistently maintained that concerns about voter suppression were inflated by Democratic politicians seeking partisan gain. He argued that election integrity measures were essential safeguards that had been unfairly branded as discriminatory by opponents who refused to recognize legitimate concerns about election security. Jasmine Crockett embodied a fundamentally different approach to political analysis and public service. Her journey to Congress had been forged by extensive experience in civil rights law, community organizing, and direct involvement with the communities most impacted by voting rights restrictions. As a member of the House Judiciary Committee, she had conducted thorough investigations into voting access matters and had developed comprehensive understanding of how election policies affected different communities. Crockett's expertise in voting rights was not abstract, but anchored in years of practical experience representing clients who had faced obstacles to political participation. Her legal background encompassed extensive work on election law cases, voting rights litigation, and analysis of the disproportionate impact of various election policies on different demographic groups. She had represented individuals and organizations challenging restrictive voting measures and had developed profound knowledge of the empirical evidence regarding voting access and election security. The specific backdrop for their confrontation involved recent legislative developments in voting rights policy. Multiple states had enacted new election laws that advocates characterized as necessary security measures, while critics contended they created unnecessary obstacles to voting access. The debate had become increasingly polarized, with each side questioning the motivations and expertise of their opponents. Ramaswamy had been invited to the Harvard Kennedy School panel as a representative of conservative viewpoints on election policy. His recent commentary had dismissed concerns about voting restrictions as partisan propaganda and had argued that Democrats were manufacturing claims about voter suppression to advance their political agenda. He had specifically criticized politicians, like Crockett, for what he characterized as inflammatory rhetoric about voting rights. Crockett had accepted the panel invitation as an opportunity to present empirical evidence about voting access issues and to address what she viewed as misconceptions about the impact of recent election law changes. Her participation reflected her commitment to substantive policy discussion and her willingness to engage with critics who questioned her analysis of voting rights challenges. The Harvard Kennedy School setting added weight to their confrontation. The prestigious academic venue was renowned for hosting serious policy discussions that influenced national political discourse. The audience included policy experts, academic researchers, and political practitioners who expected substantive engagement with complex issues rather than superficial political theater. The panel format was designed to encourage rigorous intellectual exchange between participants with different perspectives on contemporary political challenges. The moderator had introduced both speakers with acknowledgement of their expertise and had established expectations for respectful but challenging dialogue about voting rights policy and democratic participation. The confrontation ignited when Crockett was presenting her analysis of voting access trends in states that had recently implemented new election laws. Her presentation included specific data about changes in voter turnout patterns, documentation of individuals who had encountered difficulties voting, and analysis of the demographic impact of various policy changes. The evidence clearly demonstrates that these measures are having disproportionate effects on different communities, Crockett was explaining, when Ramaswamy interrupted with his dismissive gesture and condescending commentary. Congresswoman, with all due respect, these claims about voter suppression are tired Democratic talking points that ignore the basic reality of election integrity requirements, he stated with obvious confidence in his position. Every legitimate voter can access the ballot. What you're describing as suppression is simply basic security measures that any rational election system requires. The interruption was not only discourteous, but revealed Ramaswamy's assumption that he could dismiss Crockett's presentation without engaging with her specific evidence. His tone suggested that he viewed her analysis as partisan propaganda rather than serious policy research. Crockett's initial response was measured and professional, demonstrating the composure that had served her well in congressional hearings and legal proceedings. Mr. Ramaswamy, I appreciate your perspective, but I would encourage you to examine the specific evidence before dismissing concerns about voting access. She turned to a chart that displayed voter turnout data from multiple states over several election cycles. These are not talking points. These are empirical findings that show consistent patterns of reduced participation following the implementation of certain types of election policies. Ramaswamy leaned forward, clearly preparing to escalate his challenge to her analysis. Congresswoman, correlation is not causation. Reduced turnout could reflect any number of factors, You cannot simply assume that every change in voting patterns is evidence of suppression. His response revealed both his confidence in his analytical abilities and his assumption that Crockett had not considered basic methodological questions about her research. The condescension in his tone was evident to everyone in the auditorium. "You raise an important methodological point," Crockett replied calmly. "That is precisely why comprehensive analysis requires controlling for multiple variables and examining the specific mechanisms through which policy changes affect voting behavior." She moved to another visual display that showed more detailed statistical analysis. "This research controls for economic conditions, candidate quality, campaign spending levels, weather patterns, and demographic changes. The consistent finding, across multiple states and election cycles, is that certain types of policy changes produce predictable effects on voting participation rates." The sophistication of her response was immediately apparent. Rather than offering generalized rebuttals to his criticism, she was demonstrating that she had anticipated and addressed the analytical concerns he had raised. Ramaswamy attempted to maintain his dismissive stance. "Even if we accept your statistical analysis, you have not demonstrated that these effects constitute actual suppression rather than the natural consequences of implementing reasonable security measures." "That brings us to the question of what constitutes reasonable security measures," Crockett responded. "Perhaps we should examine the specific policies being implemented and their documented effects on different types of voters." She opened a thick binder that had been sitting beside her throughout the discussion. "I have here documented cases from my own legal practice and from cases handled by civil rights organizations across the country. These are not statistical abstractions, but real individuals who have encountered specific barriers to voting." The shift from statistical analysis to individual case studies represented a strategic escalation in her response. She was moving from defending her research methodology to presenting concrete evidence of the human impact of the policies under discussion. "Let me share just one example to illustrate the practical effects of these measures," she continued. "Maria Santos is a 67-year-old naturalized citizen who has voted in every election for the past 15 years. When her state implemented new identification requirements, she was told that her naturalization certificate was not acceptable identification for voting purposes. The specificity of the example created immediate tension in the room. Ramaswamy's theoretical arguments about election security were now confronting the reality of an individual voter who had been prevented from participating in democratic processes. Mrs. Santos attempted to obtain acceptable identification, but was told that she needed to provide additional documentation of her citizenship status. Despite being a legal voter for 15 years, she was required to navigate a complex bureaucratic process that ultimately prevented her from voting in 2 consecutive elections. Crockett looked directly at Ramaswamy. "This is not a talking point, Mr. Ramaswamy. This is a documented case from my legal practice. Mrs. Santos was not attempting to commit fraud. She was not trying to circumvent legitimate security measures. She was a qualified voter who was prevented from exercising her constitutional rights by administrative barriers that served no legitimate security purpose." The power of the individual story was evident in the response of the audience. The theoretical debate about election policy had become a concrete discussion about the impact of specific measures on real people. Ramaswamy attempted to regain control of the narrative by questioning the representativeness of Crockett's anecdotal evidence. "Congresswoman, while I sympathize with Mrs. Santos's experience, individual cases cannot be used to make broad policy conclusions. You cannot extrapolate from isolated incidents to system-wide problems. It was precisely the wrong approach to take with someone who had spent years building comprehensive empirical cases about voting rights issues. Rather than acknowledging the human impact of the policies he was defending, Ramaswamy was dismissing individual experiences as statistically irrelevant. Crockett's response was swift and devastating. "Mr. Ramaswamy, I appreciate your concern about statistical validity. That is exactly why I have documented not one case, but over 300 similar cases from across 12 states over the past 4 years. She opened her binder to reveal hundreds of pages of detailed case documentation. Each of these represents an individual voter who encountered barriers to participation following the implementation of new election policies. These are not isolated incidents. They represent a systematic pattern of eligible voters being prevented from exercising their constitutional rights. The visual impact of the extensive documentation was immediate. The audience could see that Crockett had not simply collected a few anecdotal examples, but had conducted comprehensive research documenting widespread problems with voting access. Furthermore, she continued, each of these cases has been verified through legal documentation, witness statements, and official correspondence with election administrators. This is not speculative analysis, but documented evidence of the actual impact of these policies on real voters. Ramaswamy's confidence was beginning to waver as he realized that he had underestimated the depth and rigor of Crockett's preparation. His assumption that she was presenting partisan talking points was being systematically dismantled by evidence of serious research and documentation. But let me address your broader point about the relationship between individual cases and policy. Analysis, Crockett said, her voice taking on the authority that comes from extensive expertise. The strength of empirical research lies precisely in the ability to identify patterns across multiple cases and to distinguish between isolated incidents and systematic problems. She turned to another section of her presentation materials. The 300 cases I have documented share common characteristics that reveal the systematic nature of these voting barriers. 78% involved voters who had previously voted without difficulty. 62% involved voters over the age of 65. 54% involved voters from communities where English is not the primary language. The statistical patterns were compelling evidence that the voting barriers were not random difficulties, but predictable consequences of specific policy choices. The demographic patterns suggested that certain communities were being disproportionately affected by the new requirements. These patterns are consistent with the findings of academic research, civil rights investigations, and court decisions that have examined the impact of similar policies in other jurisdictions, Crockett continued. The evidence base includes peer-reviewed research, legal analysis, and empirical studies conducted by nonpartisan organizations. She pulled out another document. This is a federal court decision from the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals that examined similar policies in Texas. The court found that the identification requirements in question created an undue burden on voting rights and had a discriminatory impact on minority voters, elderly voters, and low-income voters. The legal precedent added another layer of authority to her argument. She was not simply presenting her own analysis, but citing findings from federal courts that had examined similar evidence and reached similar conclusions. The court specifically noted that the state had failed to demonstrate that the identification requirements served any legitimate security purpose that could not be achieved through less restrictive means. She continued. The decision explicitly rejected arguments that individual cases of voting difficulties were isolated incidents rather than evidence of systematic problems. Ramaswamy was now clearly struggling to respond to the comprehensive nature of Crockett's presentation. His initial dismissal had been based on the assumption that she was presenting superficial partisan arguments. Instead, he was confronting detailed legal analysis, extensive empirical research, and systematic documentation of policy impacts. Mr. Ramaswamy, Crockett said, her tone becoming more direct, you began this discussion by dismissing concerns about voting access as tired talking points. I have now presented you with documented evidence from hundreds of individual cases, peer-reviewed academic research, federal court decisions, and systematic analysis of policy impacts across multiple states. The comprehensive nature of her evidence was undeniable. She had anticipated and addressed every methodological concern that could be raised about her analysis while providing multiple independent sources of verification for her conclusions. The question is no longer whether these policies are having restrictive effects on voting access. The evidence on that point is overwhelming. The question is whether we are willing to acknowledge that evidence and adjust our policies accordingly, or whether we will continue to dismiss documented problems as partisan propaganda. The moral authority in her voice was unmistakable. She had transformed the discussion from a theoretical debate about election policy into a direct challenge about intellectual honesty and willingness to engage with empirical evidence. The transformation in the auditorium was palpable, as the audience recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. What had begun as Ramaswamy's confident dismissal of Crockett's analysis had evolved into a comprehensive demonstration of the difference between superficial political commentary and serious policy expertise. Ramaswamy's response to Crockett's systematic presentation revealed the limitations of his approach to political discourse. "Congresswoman, I acknowledge that you have presented extensive documentation. These are serious concerns that merit further examination." The concession was unprecedented for someone who had built his reputation on never backing down from intellectual confrontations. The audience could see that he had been genuinely surprised by the depth and sophistication of Crockett's analysis. "I may have been too quick to characterize your concerns as partisan talking points," he continued, his tone notably more respectful than it had been at the beginning of their exchange. "The evidence you have presented suggests that there are legitimate questions about the implementation of these policies that deserve serious consideration." The acknowledgement represented a complete reversal of his initial position. Rather than dismissing voting access concerns as Democratic propaganda, he was now recognizing the legitimacy of the evidence that Crockett had presented. The audience response was immediate and sustained. The applause that followed Crockett's presentation was not partisan approval, but genuine recognition of intellectual excellence and thorough preparation. Faculty members, policy experts, and students were acknowledging that they had witnessed exceptional political discourse that elevated the discussion above typical partisan rhetoric. The immediate media coverage focused on the stark contrast between Ramaswamy's initial confidence and his eventual recognition of the strength of Crockett's analysis. Political commentators noted that the exchange demonstrated the importance of substantive preparation and empirical evidence in policy debates. Academic observers praised Crockett for her integration of legal analysis, empirical research, and individual case studies in building a comprehensive argument about voting rights policy. Her presentation became a model for how complex policy issues could be discussed with both intellectual rigor and human sensitivity. The long-term impact of the exchange extended beyond the immediate participants. Other political figures began adopting similar approaches to policy presentation, recognizing that superficial talking points were inadequate when confronting opponents who had done serious research and analysis. Legal scholars noted that Crockett's presentation had effectively demonstrated how academic research, legal precedent, and individual experiences could be integrated to build compelling arguments about constitutional rights and policy implementation. The exchange also influenced subsequent discussions about voting rights policy. Rather than dismissing concerns about voting access as partisan complaints, policymakers began examining the empirical evidence about the effects of different election policies on various communities. For Ramaswamy personally, the encounter represented a valuable lesson about the dangers of underestimating opponents and the importance of thorough preparation before engaging in policy debates. His subsequent commentary showed greater attention to empirical evidence and less reliance on dismissive rhetoric. Educational institutions began using the exchange as a case study in effective policy communication and the importance of evidence-based analysis in democratic discourse. The moment demonstrated how serious preparation and intellectual honesty could elevate political debate above superficial partisan positioning. The broader lesson of the confrontation resonated across political and academic circles. In an era when political discourse often prioritizes rhetorical effectiveness over substantive analysis, Crockett had demonstrated the enduring power of thorough research and careful preparation. The story serves as a reminder that democratic institutions function best when participants come prepared with serious analysis rather than superficial talking points. When political leaders invest in understanding complex issues and building comprehensive evidence bases, they can engage in the kind of substantive discourse that advances public understanding and improves policy outcomes. For viewers interested in moments when serious preparation confronts political grandstanding, please subscribe to our channel and activate notifications for future content. Share your thoughts in the comments about which aspect of this remarkable exchange you found most compelling, and let us know about other examples of substantive political discourse that have influenced your understanding of important issues. The complete transformation of a dismissive interruption into a comprehensive lesson about voting rights demonstrates that authentic expertise and thorough preparation remain powerful forces in political discourse, even in an era of superficial commentary and partisan rhetoric.